going to go ahead and get started. It's close to 12:15, and we don't want to leave you guys here, for after a while. My name is Aman Sharma. I'm the proud president of the Federalist Society this year. Before we get going with everything, I do want to mention that our chapter was nominated for the James Madison Award for Chapter of the Year and the Alexander Hamilton Award for Most Improved Chapter. So the student symposium that's coming up this Friday, if you're going, hopefully you'll see us pick up an award or two. We've had a very busy year, and it's our pleasure to bring you to this event. It's entitled Combating Religious Defamation, the United Nations and Free Speech Consequences. I do want to give a thank you to the Templeton Foundation and to ILS. Their president, Ben Polanski, is here. Please give him a thank you as well. You see him later on. With that, I'll explain the format of the event for today. It's a little bit different. We'll have, at the request of both speakers, a bit lengthier of an introduction by Professor Knechtle, who's our visiting speaker for today. So it'll be a 15-minute introduction by him, a 12-minute introduction by Professor Quigley, a 10-minute rebuttal in the same order, and then a question and answer session. So slight modification. I'll do the introductions and then we'll get going. Professor John Quigley teaches international law, law of war, and comparative law here at Moritz. He's been a faculty member since 1969, and as such, he's our longest tenured faculty member. Professor Quigley spent a year as a visiting professor in Tanzania before coming to Ohio State. He also served as a research scholar at Moscow State University. At Harvard Law School, he was a research associate in comparative law. He's active in international human rights work, and Professor Quigley has also written numerous books and articles in international law, the United Nations, and human rights. In 1995, he received the Ohio State University Distinguished Scholar Award for his outstanding scholarly achievements. And our guest speaker today, Professor John Knechtle, teaches constitutional law, international law, comparative law, the Caribbean Law Clinic, legal history, and comparative in constitutional law at Florida Coastal. He received his BA from Wheaton College and his JD from Emory, where he was the editor-in-chief of the International Law Journal. He also studied at the Institut d'études européennes, Vrije Universiteit Brussels, in Brussels, Belgium. I hope I got that right. Flanders is like the one language I chose not to study. In 2004, Professor Knechtle was a Fulbright Scholar and served as visiting professor of international comparative law at the University of World Economy and Diplomacy in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Professor Knechtle advises foreign governments on a range of issues, from constitutional questions, international environmental law, and the organization of the bar. Professor Knechtle has been a contributing author to 10 books, including 2 First Amendment case books, and he's authored or co-authored of 10 law journal articles, including 2 that directly relate to this one, to this event, including one entitled "When to Regulate Hate Speech," which is the Penn State Law Review. And with that, please join me in welcoming first Professor John Knechtle.
Thank you, Aman. It's a pleasure being here for your meeting. I thought before we started discussing the pros and cons of this proposal, I should give you a little background. I don't know how much you all have heard about this concept of defamation of religion, so I wanted to give you just a little historical context. The issue first appeared in 1999 when Pakistan brought before the Commission on Human Rights a resolution entitled Defamation of Islam. The purpose of the resolution was to urge the Commission to take a stand against what Pakistan and other Organization of Islamic Country member states claimed was a Western campaign to defame Islam. The resolution's title was later changed to include all religions, although the text of numerous subsequent resolutions on this issue continued to single out Islam. Since 1999, non-binding resolutions on the defamation of religions have been adopted by the Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Committee annually. The mobilization of many non-Western UN member states to adopt measures against the defamation of religions rapidly gathered momentum after the attacks of September 11, 2001. This movement was propelled by the link between the war against terror and the rise of Islamophobia. The mobilization peaked in the autumn of September 2005, triggered by the outcry against the publication by the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten of a series of cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. don't know where you were 6 years ago, but that received quite a bit of international press coverage. The Organization of Islamic Countries, I'll call it OIC, lobbied to have the World Conference Against Racism develop international standards prohibiting the defamation of religion. It was argued that defamation of religion is closely related to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and intolerance. In 2005, Yemen introduced a resolution entitled Combating Defamation of Religions in the UN General Assembly. 101 states voted in favor of the resolution, establishing a pattern of General Assembly resolutions that were to follow. The votes have, as you can tell by the initial vote, it was a pretty substantial majority. The votes still at the UN General Assembly support the resolution. However, it's narrowed over the years, largely because of the ongoing debate and opposition coming primarily from Western Europe and the United States. It became a more recent issue because he's being brought up and he's being referred to different committees, different working groups, which then bring back the reports, and so it continues to be an ongoing issue. For example, the process leading up to the Durban Review Conference, which was an update on the conference on dealing with racial discrimination. It became very controversial. It was one of the reasons why some of the Western European states ended up boycotting the meeting. This was a meeting held in Geneva in April of 2009. Besides calling for international prohibitions on speech to protect religions from defamation, they also charged Israel with engaging in a new kind of apartheid, a crime against humanity, and a form of genocide. When they actually held the Durban Review Conference in Geneva, there was a great debate on whether or not to participate. President Obama decided not to participate. The political right celebrated while the Congressional Black Caucus was deeply dismayed. The U.S., just the U.S. position, both under the Bush administration and under the current Obama administration, is that they are not supportive of this resolution. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that out there as sort of a historical background before we go into the arguments pro and con for this concept of defamation of religion. Again, my first statement I want to put is again into a little bit of a context. As you may know, the United States is perhaps the most protective of free speech of countries in the world. So, for example, the status of hate speech regulation, which some of this defamation of religion could be categorized under. The U.S. Supreme Court does not prohibit hate speech unless it falls into one of the existing categories of speech, which either do not receive First Amendment protection or receive less protection. Examples would be incitement to imminent violence or threats of illegal harm or fighting words. So unless hate speech in this country falls into one of those categories, it cannot be prescribed because it is viewed as viewpoint-based speech and therefore unconstitutional. Europe makes hate speech based on religion illegal. And so it has European countries actually prescribe speech in more ways than we do in the United States. However, as I mentioned before, the European countries as a whole think defamation of religion is going too far. Okay, now I'm going to move to why a defamation of religion violates freedom of expression. Defamation of religion is viewpoint discrimination. It criminalizes the expression of ideas which are politically incorrect. Defamation of religion provisions, including blasphemy laws, protect sets of beliefs, ideas, and values. Such laws prohibit individuals from not only vilifying or ridiculing, but even criticizing religious ideologies. In other words, only positive portrayals of religion are allowed, not negative ones. And that, in the United States here, is viewed as viewpoint discrimination and would be held unconstitutional under several cases, but including RAB versus the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. A bedrock principle of free speech in a democracy is that no idea, religious or otherwise, is above questioning, challenging, disagreeing with, disputing, and even ridiculing. Satirical portrayals of religion, such as the Danish cartoons, would be illegal. In fact, the Danish cartoons are part of what energized the Organization of Islamic States countries. They were furious that the cartoonist who drew those cartoons and the newspaper publishers were not criminally prosecuted. Once you give the government the power to ban speech that is offensive, where does it stop? And the truth is, many religious ideas are offensive to somebody. Another reason is that modern defamation law is designed to protect reputations of individuals, not groups or not ideas. Defamation of religion law stands in sharp contrast to traditional defamation laws. They do not protect religions or philosophies or other ideas from slander or libel. Ideas are fair game for open debate, including a harsh and critical debate. I should throw in here, just as a side note, although I am arguing very strongly here for free speech to win out, that's not because I don't believe that debates shouldn't be occur in a respectful and in a civil environment. It's just that when you ask the law to step in, when you ask the government to step in and decide which ideas can be communicated and which ideas cannot, I think you're putting a level of trust in the government which is unwarranted, and I'll come back to that. In fact, even dangerous. What religions will be protected under defamation of religion? Enforcement of defamation of religion cases in the Organization of Islamic Country, which include anti-blasphemy, anti-vilification laws, are typically left up to the discretion of local officials, who act, of course, on their own interpretations. Ultimately, defamation of religion measures empower majorities against dissenters, the dominant religions against the minority religions. For example, the Pakistani Penal Code, section 295C, I'll quote from it. Whoever by words either spoken or written, or by visible representation, or by any imputation, innuendo, or insinuation, directly or indirectly defiles the sacred name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, shall be punished with death or imprisonment for life, and shall also be liable to fine. So Pakistan has the death penalty for anyone who through spoken or written words or through visible representation, i.e. including cartoons, directly or even indirectly defiles the name of Muhammad. In Pakistan, defiling, damaging, or desecrating the Quran is punishable with life imprisonment. If you caught any of the news media not too long ago about this minister in Florida who was going to burn copies of the Quran, obviously a pretty stupid and unwise decision, but in the United States, still protected by the First Amendment. You can burn a copy of the Bible, you can burn the U.S. flag in this country, and ideology does not, the government won't step in to protect the offense that may be felt from that ideological statement. In Pakistan, insulting another's religious feelings can be punished with 10 years of prison. In Egypt, a professor at Cairo University was declared an apostate for teaching his students to read parts of the Quran metaphorically. All of these examples involve branches of the government deciding which religious viewpoints were acceptable, defamatory, and which were not. This is not the role of government in a democratic society that recognizes the right to free speech. This is antithetical to the idea of a marketplace of ideas. Under defamation of religion, unlike current laws of defamation of individuals, truth is no defense. Why? Because courts will not want to decide the truth of competing religious claims. You say, I don't believe that Christianity, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Well, no court wants to get involved in that dispute. And you may use harsher language to express your opinion on that subject. And courts don't want to get involved in that type of decision for a good reason, because then at that point you're moving the country into more of a theocracy where they're going to decide religious truth claims. So under defamation of religion, truth is no defense. I'd like to mention a little bit of the history of the First Amendment, because the arguments against this, I think, run deep in our history. The First Amendment was written in largely response to activities in England, namely licensing and prior restraints. Under English law, the licensing of printers included submission of publications to officials with power to give or to refuse authority to print. And obviously they would look at materials over and decide whether or not it was favorable to them or not before they would let the printing to occur. And there was a crime of seditious libel. A particular concern which developed in England in the case of De Libellis Famosus, which came out of the Star Chamber in 1606. The case De Libellis Famosus involved defendants who had ridiculed clergy. So this was, again, a type of religious defamation that occurred in England. It was later expanded to include the king and others, although it was primarily the king that took advantage of it. This crime was used by governments and religious leaders in England to quash the critics. English law defines seditious libel as the intentional publication without lawful excuse or justification of written blame of any public man or of the law or of any institution established by law. Under seditious libel, truth was no defense. Since maintaining a proper regard for the government or religious authorities was the goal of this criminal act, it followed that truth was just as reprehensible as falsehood and was eliminated as a defense. In fact, if the seditious libel were true, the damage are also increased because it caused more damage to the official's reputation. Defamation of religion is, in some ways, a revival of seditious libel, as in the case I just described to you. Truth is no defense, but even more egregious is that at least seditious libel involved defamation of individual, while defamation of religion involves defamation of ideas, of a philosophy, of a religious belief. I'll also just mention shortly that defamation of religion, I think, also violates freedom of religion. Freedom of religion includes the right to talk to others about your religion in public forums. That means teaching a population religious tolerance, not prohibiting religious speech among different religions. Freedom of religion includes the right to change religions. This can only happen if there is some sort of marketplace of religious ideas where religious people can discuss their agreements and disagreements. And lastly, religion is different than race. Defamation of religion has been raised in the UN conference dealing with race. This is not the appropriate venue to raise issues of religious discrimination. How are race and religion different? Virtually all religions have strains that theologically consider their religion the one true religion. This religious exclusivity has long been recognized in international human rights law, while racial superiority has not. Let Professor Quigley now respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're very grateful to Professor Knechtle for leaving the pleasant confines of Florida to come to Ohio in the month of February. I don't know if that's a sign of great valor or one that could be characterized in more negative terms, but in any event, we're grateful. This issue of defamation of religion is one that, as Professor Knechtle said, is one that has emerged in the last decade, largely at the instance of the organization of the Islamic Conference, which is a group of states that kind of functions to some extent as an entity within the United Nations, promoting issues of concern to them. One of the important points that he made is that the resolutions that have been adopted are in the realm of what we might call soft law or non-binding resolutions. That is, there has been no serious effort yet to try to put this into the form of a treaty that would require states to do any particular thing. It seems to me whatever one thinks about this issue and the rights and wrongs of it, it's not something that is likely to, that is the sentiment that's behind these resolutions, is not likely to affect the law in different countries in any significant way, particularly because of the fact that the view on this issue is so split within the United Nations. As Professor Knechtle says, the resolutions that have been adopted not overwhelmingly, but with significant opposition. Essentially, you've got the countries in most of Africa and the Arab world, the Islamic world supporting, and you've got most of the Western Hemisphere and Europe on the other side. A large number of states abstain on the resolutions because they're perhaps sympathetic to the idea that people should be respectful of other religions, but at the same time they don't want to say that states have to do something in terms of legal measures that would infringe on freedom of speech. So you find a huge number of abstentions. The resolutions have been adopted in several UN fora, starting with the Commission on Human Rights in 1999, and then that commission was replaced in 2006 by something called the Human Rights Council. It has adopted a couple of these resolutions, and then they've gone to the next higher level, to the General Assembly of the UN, which most recently adopted a resolution on this issue in December of last year. But the critical point, I think, still is that the states are not likely to take this any farther beyond these what you might call verbal resolutions. The Secretary General of the UN was asked by I think it was by the Human Rights Council a couple of years ago to survey states on how they deal with this issue, and the surveys came back indicating that they do try to prohibit the incitement to religious hatred, but they haven't really taken the next step to try to prohibit the denigration of religion in general. And that is, I think, the issue on which you find the opposition crystallizing to these resolutions. That is, as Professor Knechtle says, that there is a rather widespread view at the international level that it is appropriate to limit speech that incites to hatred based on whatever ground, in particular on religious grounds. These resolutions seem to take the matter a step farther and say that there should be a prohibition of speech that is against the religion as opposed to against the adherence to the religion. And that's the basis on which a number of NGOs that promote free speech have come out against this. So this is a rather tricky issue for much of the world. As Professor Knechtle says, the United States is really at one end of the spectrum at the international level on this issue, in the extent to which we elevate freedom of speech over protection of the sentiments of those who may be offended by the speech, and you find other states being much more concerned that speech will lead to violence, that speech that engenders hatred will result in violence against groups. And you find this in particular in Europe against the background of the events of the Second World War, and you find this being crystallized in legislation that makes it a crime to deny the facts of the Holocaust, of the atrocities against Jews in Europe under the Nazi government. So for much of the world, to have a resolution that calls for combating the defamation of religion isn't really that much different from what they already view as being appropriate. For us in the United States, it looks like something hugely different from what we consider the appropriate limitations on the law. The resolutions have been watered down a bit to kind of appeal to the Europeans more, but still the European states have not gone in favor. They overwhelmingly vote against. I think the operative term in the resolutions is the one Professor Knechtle used, and that is vilification of religion. That is an attempt is made to distinguish between some kinds of anti-religion speech and other kinds of anti-religion speech, so as to avoid saying that you can't engage in rational debate about theology. And that's why this term vilification is used. Now, what that term means is obviously not very, very clear, but it does, I think, indicate an effort to limit the extent of what these resolutions might reach. I think you see something of that distinction in the law as it has crystallized in Europe on these matters. There have been cases in Europe in which speech has been directed against a religion. The major cases have actually involved speech against the Roman Catholic religion, where there has been a prohibition at the national level, where the matter has been taken to the European Court of Human Rights, and where the European Court of Human Rights has upheld the prohibition on the basis that the speech was not speech that you could say falls in the range of debate about theology, but was aimed at putting a religion down in a way that the court found to be contemptuous or non-civil, let's say. One of these cases involved a film that the Austrian government banned. A film that involved portrayal of the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ in a kind of a sexual way. There was another case involving Britain that involved also a portrayal of a saint that is revered in the Roman Catholic Church, Saint Teresa, and implied kind of a sexual relationship between her and Jesus Christ. And it was in this context that the European Court upheld the prohibitions on the theory that the this was a portrayal that was not in the realm of theological debate. So, I mean, whatever one thinks about those decisions, and I personally think that they were not particularly well taken, but whatever one thinks about them, they focused on something that I think is reflected in these resolutions with the term vilification. I think that the thrust behind these resolutions, the reason that the Organization of the Islamic Conference has been putting them forward, actually has very little to do with religion. I think it relates more to the relationship between the Western world and the Islamic world, and a feeling that the Islamic world is disrespected by the Western world, and that the Western world has focused, particularly in the post-2001 period, on Islam as being the problem, and that this creates much negative sentiment there in that part of the world, because it's thought that Islam itself is being portrayed as promoting ideas that are held only by a minority within that faith. So I do see this as something that doesn't really relate so much to religion as it does to the broader political relationship that the governments in that part of the world view themselves as having been put down by the Western world, that the interference of the Western world, and in particular the United States in the political systems there, has occurred in a way that shows that that part of the world is disrespected, and I think we may well be seeing a change in this with all the changes that are going on, the political changes going on right now in that part of the world, where I think a newfound sense of respect is being developed that may lead to those governments not seeking to promote this kind of resolution in the future. But I think that the United States in particular does kind of spur on the sentiment underlying these resolutions by taking positions that are seen as negative to the populations there, if not specifically on a religious basis, but to the populations more generally. And the most recent manifestation of that, I think, would be the veto that the United States cast last Friday in the UN Security Council on a resolution that would have condemned the Israeli settlements in the West Bank as being violative of international law. And the fact that we vetoed that over and against the overwhelming sentiment of the rest of the world, including our closest European allies, was taken as a put-down of the people of that part of the world. And I think it's that kind of thing that leads to the promotion of this kind of resolution. President Obama tried to overcome this to some extent by the speech that he gave in Cairo shortly after taking office. But I think that whatever good he did with that speech has been eroded by the subsequent actions of our government. I think this is probably what is behind all of this, and that the issue may well resolve itself if the political situation resolves itself. Thank you.
I don't at all disagree that politics is often what's behind these types of resolutions, and that's what drives them. But at the same time, it's important that that they be separated. That the concern that perhaps the Islamic community is treated in a stereotypical fashion by our media, or is not well understood in the West, that might be true. That's probably true for every minority group, religious group or ethnic group or racial group, so on and so forth. But the right response is not to then restrict that speech, is what I argue. The right response is actually more speech, more education, more communication. And just since 9/11, I think probably the level of exchange, the amount of information that's gone back and forth has certainly raised our awareness in this country of Islam, of our Islamic community, so on and so forth. And as a whole, that's a good thing. To respond to just a couple of the arguments supporting these resolutions, I should mention too, as Professor Quigley said, the votes are getting closer now. Initially, the votes for these resolutions were overwhelming. Now they're getting closer. There's still a majority of countries that support the resolution, which arguably makes the incumbent in the United States to stay involved in this discussion and in this debate. And the NGOs like Human Rights Watch and so on and so forth, they actually urged President Obama to participate in the Durban conference, even though he ended up deciding not to. Because if you're not at the bargaining table, you can't have any impact on these resolutions. You're not there. Your representatives aren't there. So you need to stay engaged. I'm not saying there isn't a place for boycotting certain meetings, but in my view, that should be a rare occurrence that you think the resolution is just so wrong that you're not even participating in the discussion. I think it makes more sense to participate. All right, just to review a few of the arguments that they're put forward in defense of this defamation of religion. First is the events of September 11th markedly increased stereotyping, discrimination, and animus towards Muslims, which necessitates remedial measures. I think, at least pertaining to this country, I think the Supreme Court got it right on this, and that is the correct response is to focus on prescribing actions. So when there is an act of discrimination, when there is an act of violence, you hold those people accountable, but you don't restrict the speech. Tolerance should be encouraged through education, dialogue, and civic leadership. When there is a lack of information out there, the best response is that it needs more speech, it needs more information, more engagement. Another argument is that internet access, saturation, and interconnectedness raise the likelihood that inflammatory media will reach an audience which is known to and will likely react violently to such media, and so such speech should be restricted. It's kind of like the heckler's veto, for those of you who studied the First Amendment. And the question is, why should constitutionally protected speech in the West be restricted? Because some religious groups in another part of the world may react violently. Doesn't this subject Western democracies to the lowest common denominator? The law should punish the violence, not silence the speaker. When you inform the thugs of the world, and I'm referring this to in any category, that all you need to do is make threats and occasionally make good on those threats, and the law will suppress the speech the thugs want suppressed, then the result is more thuggery, not less, because that is then used as a tool to shut speakers down. Another argument that's been put forward is that the Muslim faith is so intertwined with the lives of the people that to assault the sentiments of the religion is itself paramount to denigrating the individuals themselves. That's probably a statement that can be made not just about the Muslim faith, but a variety of other faiths. And it still raises the question of why the right to free speech should be lost because these individuals even whatever religious category they are, cannot differentiate between criticisms of their religion and criticisms of themselves. And in democracies, you want to encourage critical thinking, not discourage it. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I essentially agree with Professor Knechtle on his freedom of speech analysis. That is, I don't think this should be taken to the point of prohibiting speech that either defames religions or even the speech that is prohibited in many European countries, incitement to hatred. In this country, we do have something we call hate crimes, and I think there's sometimes confusion about that. But this category of crime in the United States is not a speech crime. It's a crime that involves an assault, let's say an assault based on the person's ethnicity, based on the person's race, and we give a heightened penalty on that basis. We call that a hate crime, but it's quite different from the kind of thing that you find in Europe. But I think in many countries they do view speech that engenders disrespect for a particular group as being harmful and punishable on the rationale that it may lead to violence. And that's the step that I think distinguishes the approach in the United States from the approach in many other countries. But as I said earlier, I don't think this is likely to be taken very far. That is, I don't think it's likely that the European countries or the United States will on the basis of these resolutions, change their law to any appreciable extent. The promoters of the defamation of religion resolution were engaging in what I found as some interesting attempts at compromises in the last discussion of this in the General Assembly of the UN in December, because they were discussing a large number of resolutions. One of them was a resolution on extrajudicial execution that called on states to combat extrajudicial execution, and the resolution referred to a number of groups that were identified as being particularly vulnerable. It said, the state should combat extrajudicial execution, especially when it's based on race and several other things. The United States tried to add, by way of amendment, lesbian and gay people to that. Which was probably a way of trying to tweak the Organization of Islamic Conference, because those states are very much opposed to any promotion of gay rights at the international level. But in the context of these two resolutions coming up really at the same time, the representatives of the Organization of Islamic Conference apparently said to the United States, well, if you don't demand a recorded vote on your resolution that includes adding protection for gay people, if we could just have that resolution adopted by consensus, we might be willing not to object to it if you would give us something on our combating defamation resolutions. If you would come around and support or at least abstain rather than voting against. But that apparently didn't work. But I think it is at bottom important that freedom of speech be given priority in these situations. Even though there is, and I think we have to recognize this, a strongly held belief that speech that is more generally negative about groups is harmful. And perhaps, you know, the promotion of these resolutions will have some positive effect in that regard, just simply just in the way the Republicans and Democrats are talking about having civil discourse now. But at bottom, I think it's not appropriate to try to punish this kind of speech by a criminal prohibition.
All right, at this point, we'll open up the floor to questions and answers for our speakers. Yes, in the back.
Mr. Knechtle, I guess that I'm just wondering a little bit more about your view, because you mentioned that democracy encourages critical thinking, but I don't think that hate speech at all is critical thinking. I think it's just the opposite. It's just ignorance. So when you say that there should be no government control over this issue, couldn't government control in a different way rather than saying you can't have it, you can't say these certain things? Couldn't they say we have to implement like programs for students to learn about different religions? Not just students, all people need to take some kind of, I don't know, information session or to learn or to combat the ignorance, which I think is the reason for the hate speech. I don't think that's the democracy. That's just, you know, that's stopping democracy because it's infringing on people's way of thinking and understanding that, you know, religion isn't where the problem is.
Do you have a question?
I guess what's your view on that? How is it encouraging critical thinking if it's really just critical?
Right. First of all, I agree with you that words can hurt. Words can be ignorant. Words can be offensive. Language sometimes can limit debate as opposed to develop and expand debate. And so I guess to pick up on your point, I think the right approach is not to put the restriction on the language and say you can't say those things, but to do things like you're suggesting, such as encourage comparative courses in comparative religion, courses in which you study and learn about different groups. That, for me, is a more constructive approach and doesn't restrict the individual right of free speech. I teach constitutional law in my law school, and one of the things I try to do in the class is create an environment where everyone will speak their views. Because there's some people in there who have views that I know they know are not popular in the group. But it is far better for them to get out on the table and then start talking about them. I live in the South. I'm from North Florida, but it's really part of the South. And for example, we have a lot of rednecks in our school. And they've grown up in rural Georgia. They come to our school and they have views that most academia would just scoff at. But how are they going to be able to move beyond that view if they're not able to just state it? I mean, you can't even learn if you can't say, well, this is what I think. And you can say, okay, you can then just criticize them, or you can say, well, let's think about that. Let's explore that. What's behind that? Why are you saying that? And have a discussion. And it's a challenge because we all have our own viewpoints. It's very easy to let our own viewpoints just kind of drive the discussion. And when we find something that's offensive, we just want to shut them down. But that doesn't create the dialogue that's needed.
Just a follow-up.
Sure.
I guess that I completely agree. And I feel like you're looking at it in such a good view, like when we're in a classroom discussing issues like, calmly and rationally. But I'm thinking that, hate speech can be a totally different issue when we're talking about movies, TV, or just people throwing words at each other and kind of in a different environment. How do you deal with that environment?
I'm a commentator for the local affiliates of ABC, NBC, and Fox News in Jacksonville. And when the case of the minister, he only has about 15 very popular view for me to go on the network and say, well, no, I think the First Amendment actually protects it. I wish he wouldn't do it. It is offensive. I'm not sure what good comes out of this other than maybe these people who maybe agree with this position start to realize how the rest of society feels, and maybe this really, why is it so offensive? Maybe they will start to learn. So that's an example outside the classroom where there is offensive speech. But Thomas Jefferson said that he also did discuss this once, and he said there's lots of bad speech out there, but the only problem is what's worse than letting that free speech going is the alternative. Meaning for the government to come in and start saying, that's offensive, so we're gonna shut that speech down. How do we find that? I mean, what grounds does a government have to decide what is offensive and what isn't? If that's the standard, that's a highly subjective standard for a court or any government official to try to apply. So I acknowledge that injuries occur. Words do injure. They do cause offense. But I think the alternative is worse.
Other questions? Yes?
I agree with you as a matter of a broad interpretation of the First Amendment, but that's appropriate here in a state of democracy in the U.S. To apply that definition is appropriate for television or private democracies. Wouldn't you see that in those countries it would be necessary to shut down hate speech, not because it's offensive, but because it actually produces harm? For example, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, or Japan.
Yeah, I've written about this actually, when to regulate hate speech. And I think there are a lot of factors that go into that decision. All laws are a reflection of our history, our culture, our legal development. And so I am not one that encourages coming up with one formula that fits every country in the world. You have to look at their context. The Holocaust didn't occur here. If our government had murdered 10 million people during World War II in concentration camps in the U.S., we might have a different sensibility about that issue. That didn't occur on our territory. So I do acknowledge that, but I'm also very cautious about that because there is a natural inclination of government to prohibit speech it doesn't like. And you see it in every country in the world. Even in my First Amendment class, when I ask students, I come in and say, well, give some example of hate speech. I said, do you think the government should do something to stop it? Now, I can get a majority of the class to raise their hands and say, yeah, the government should stop that. Why? Because it's offensive. And because of that, it's very easy for governments, particularly more authoritarian governments, to want to limit that speech. And what was one of the things that Mubarak did in Egypt? He tried to shut down the internet. He tried to shut down Twitter, Facebook, so on and so forth, because he didn't want the speech to get around. It's a method of control.
Other questions? Yes?
First of all, I'd like to say that I completely agree with you guys. Number two, I'd like to ask that if this has been implemented in the Islamic world, I'm wondering about equal enforcement, because I know that the Saudi government and the Pakistani government support madrasas that I would consider hate speech. And I would also consider that a lot of religious texts, in the very text of a lot of religious texts, it attacks unbelievers, condemns them to hell, condemns them as sinners. And I guess in the countries that have supported this kind of law, is it equally enforced, in your opinion, as to like secular beliefs, as to atheistic beliefs, as to agnostic beliefs, and as to other religions that are minority religions?
One of my arguments earlier was that it's not enforced equally, and I don't think it will be, because what will happen is the dominant religion will use it to their advantage. Because who's offended? Who does the government respond to? They don't respond generally to the minorities. they respond to the majority. So there's a huge outcry about some statement, and they respond to that. So no, that's exactly one of my criticisms of it, that it is used as a tool to suppress minorities by the majority.
Other questions? Well, it's getting close to 1:15, so if there are no other questions, we can sum this up at this point. Please give me a round of applause for our speakers today.